He was born when World War I was still being fought. He died during a sickness that spread all over the world. In between. John Sonny Franzese lived for 103 years, the longest life of any gangster in American history. People said he killed his first person when he was 14. By the time he was done, the police thought the number of dead bodies was somewhere between 40 and 50 people. He hung out with famous people like Frank Sinatra, dated movie stars, and controlled the streets of New York very strictly. His own son secretly recorded him and sent him to jail at age 93. And yet, Sonny never gave in. He never told on anyone. He never snitched. He lived and died by the old rules. Tonight, we are going to tell you the whole amazing story of the man they called the last of the old-fashioned mafia bosses. Before we get into this incredible trip through the secret, criminal world of New York, I want to know where you are watching from right now. Are you in New York, where Sonny walked on those streets where bad things happened? Or maybe you are on the other side of the world, listening to this as you fall asleep. Write where you are and what time it is for you in the comments below. And if you are very interested in true stories about the old school mafia, the real gangsters who lived by rules that are hard for us to understand, today, hit that subscribe button and turn on the alerts. We are making a group of friends who stay up late and love history. And I do not want you to miss a single story. Also, that like button, give it a tap. It tells YouTube to share this with other people who love these deep looks into the history of crime groups. And if you stay for the whole story of Sonny's amazing 103-year life, write 103 in the comments, so I know you were here for the whole ride. All right, let's get comfortable. This is going to be a long night. Pour yourself a drink. It's settled. And let me tell you about the man they said could not die. The year was 1917. World War I was happening all over Europe, killing millions of people in muddy ditches and on battlefields filled with poison gas. In Naples, Italy, on February 6th, a child was born. His parents were Carmine and Maria Franzese, people from Italy who had already become American citizens but were visiting their home country. They named him John, but the world would come to know him as Sonny. 6 months after he was born, the Franzese family returned to America, moving to Greenpoint, Brooklyn. It was a neighborhood where the hope for a better life met the tough parts of being new to the country every day. Carmine Franzese was an honest man in a neighborhood full of dishonest people. He ran a bakery, getting up before sunrise to mix dough and heat up the ovens. He provided bread for families who often had a hard time paying for it. The smell of fresh-baked bread filled their home. It was a warm feeling, different from the cold streets outside, where a different kind of work was being done. Maria Franzese gave her youngest son the nickname Sonny. It was a loving nickname that people would one day say with fear and respect. All over the 5 parts of New York City, the nickname was funny in a strange way. It made you think of brightness, warmth, and being good. The man Sonny would become did not have any of these good things, at least not in the world outside his front door. Brooklyn in the 1920s and 1930s was a place with many differences. On one hand, it was a neighborhood of working families, church parties, and corner store owners who let people pay later when money was tight. On the other hand, it was the place where some of the most famous criminals in American history got their start. Law against alcohol had turned the country into a place with giant secret bars, and for young men who wanted to be successful but did not have money from their family, the fastest way to get rich was by breaking the law. Sonny grew up watching these two different worlds. His father showed one path: honest work, a little bit of money, and a feeling of doing the right thing. The men in nice suits who walked the streets with confidence, who never seemed to worry about money, and who got respect just by looking at someone, showed something else completely. For a young man with more dreams than chances, the choice seemed clear. By the time Sonny was old enough for high school, he had already moved away from the life his parents had hoped he would live. School was not interesting. To him, the lessons did not seem important compared to what he was learning on the streets. He dropped out of school, choosing instead to learn from the real teachers of his neighborhood, the men who took bets and the men who made people follow the rules. They were the men who understood that power in their world came from two things: fear and respect. In 1938, at the age of 21, Sonny Franzese was arrested for the first time. He was charged with assault. The details of what happened have been forgotten over time. But what is still important is what it meant. It was the first mark on a crime record that would last for 80 years. It was the first sentence in a very long, very dark book. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and America joined World War I. Young men all over the country lined up to join the army. They were excited to serve their country and fight against bad leaders overseas. In 1942, Sonny Franzese found himself signed up for the United States Army. For most young men, this would have been a very important time, a chance to prove they were brave and to serve something bigger than themselves. For Sonny, it lasted less than a year. In 1942, Sonny Franzese was let go from the army with a note that would follow and describe him for the rest of his life: psychoneurotic with pronounced homicidal tendencies. Think about that for a moment. Army doctors, who were trained to find men who could handle the stress of fighting, had looked at Sonny Franzese and pretty much said, "This man is too dangerous, even for a war." What did they see? What tests did they do? What did Sonny say or do that made trained experts decide that a man willing to kill was somehow too willing, too good at it, and too disconnected from normal human feelings? The records do not tell us the details, but what they decided says a lot. The United States military, in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, decided they did not want Sonny Franzese, but the secret criminal world of New York did. By the late 1930s and all through the 1940s, Sonny had already begun working for Joseph Profaci, the boss of what would later become the Colombo crime family. Profaci was one of the first bosses chosen during the Castellammarese War, the fight that had changed the Italian-American Mafia into the five families. This setup would control organized crime for many years. In Profaci's group, Sonny learned the business. Not the simple street crimes of small thefts and drunk fights, but the smart plans that made serious money, like cheating people and loaning money at very high rates. He learned how to run businesses that looked real on paper, but were used to hide illegal money. He learned how to give money to desperate men and then get that money back in ways that would never be in any banking textbook. Most importantly, he learned when to use violence and how to do it well. In 1947, court papers would say that Sonny had committed rape. He was never arrested for this. The case was hidden. Like so many claims against powerful men in those days, we cannot know for sure if the claim was true, if it was a trick to get money, or if it was something else. What we do know is that in the world Sonny lived in, those kinds of charges rarely stuck to men who knew the right people. Justice was something that happened to other people. The streets of New York were Sonny's school, and he turned out to be a very good student. While other young men his age were coming back from the war with medals and bad memories, getting ready to start families and jobs, Sonny Franzese was getting better at the art of scaring people, collecting money, and getting rid of problems. By the time the 1940s turned into the 1950s, He was ready for his graduation day. The year 1950 was a turning point in Sonny Franzese's life, not at the age of 33. He was officially made a full member of the Franzese family. For people who do not know about mafia traditions, becoming a made man was not just a promotion or a new job title. It was a promise made in blood. A promise for life that was more important than any other, including family, religion, and country. The ceremony itself was full of old traditions and special meanings. Though the exact details of Sonny's ceremony were kept private, the usual ceremony followed a pattern that had been done for many, many years. A room full of made men, a table with a gun and a knife, and a picture of a saint that is set on fire in the new member's hands while he says the promise. He promises to live by the rules of Cosa Nostra, to put the family above everything else, to never share the secrets of the group, and to know that this promise could only end with death. The most important part of this promise was Omerta, the code of silence. Omerta was not just about not talking to the police. It was a whole way of life. A belief that you had to be completely loyal and completely quiet. To break Omerta was not just a crime. It was the worst kind of betrayal. It was a betrayal that deserved death, with no trial or chance to argue. For Sonny Franzese, this code would become the thing that described him best. Over the next 70 years, through arrests and trials, through years in jail and always being watched, through betrayals and family fights, Sonny would stay silent. It would become his reputation, his badge of honor, the thing that made him different, even among criminals who said they lived by the same rules. After he was made a member, Sonny began working for Sebastian Buster Alloy's crew, which was based in New York and New Jersey. By the mid-1950s, his skill and toughness had earned him another promotion, Caporegime, or captain. This meant he now had his own crew, a group of soldiers and helpers who answered directly to him. He was a middle manager in the company of organized crime, and like any good middle manager, he was in charge of making money and solving problems. His official job was owner of a dry cleaning store in Brooklyn. On paper, John Franzese was a small business owner, a person who helped his local town, and a person who paid taxes. The dry cleaning business was real. It even had customers, workers, and books that would look okay in a basic check. But it was mostly a cover, a real-looking front that explained where his money came from and gave a good answer. When anyone asked what he did for a living, his real business was much less clean. Fear was his. Money. Broken bones were his calling cards. Money, lots of money, was what he made. By the mid-1950s, Sonny Franzese had changed from a tough guy on the street into a professional criminal, and his name was starting to be known outside of his neighborhood. If there was a best time in Sonny Franzese's life, a time when the worlds of fancy living and violence came together perfectly, it was during the 1950s and 1960s. This was when Sonny was at his best, both in his body and in his job within the group. And this was most clear at the Copacabana, the famous nightclub on East 60th Street in Manhattan. The Copacabana was not just a nightclub. It was a special place. Opened in 1940, the Copa, as the regulars called it, was where famous people came to see others and be seen. The room was cozy but fancy, with seats at different levels so that everyone had a view of the stage. The shows were the best, with singers, dancers, and comedians who had become famous. And sitting at the best tables, night after night, were men like Sonny Franzese. Sonny was a regular at the Copa during its best years. He hung out with the biggest names in entertainment: Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Ava Gardner, Jane Mansfield, Marilyn Monroe, Bobby Darin, and Dionne Warwick. He knew famous boxers like Rocky, Graciano, and Jake LaMotta. These were not just people he met once. according to many stories. These famous people actively wanted Sonny's friendship, knowing that his approval and protection were very valuable in a city where the lines between real business and organized crime were often blurry on purpose. One story, told so often it has become a mafia legend, said that Frank Sinatra himself once kissed Sonny's ring in public. In mafia culture, kissing a boss's ring is a sign of deep respect, almost like you are giving up to them. Whether this really happened exactly as told is less important than what it means. Sonny Franzese was respected, not just by street thugs and bet takers, but by some of the most famous people in America. Why did famous people like to be around gangsters like Sonny? The reasons were complicated. For some, it was a real friendship. For others, it was knowing that having connections to the mob could help or hurt their jobs. Owners might not hire them. Union problems could shut down their shows. They needed protection from different dangers, both real and made up. For others, it was just the dangerous and fancy feeling of it all. The thrill of being friends with men who lived outside the rules that everyone else had to follow. Sonny played the part perfectly. He dressed very well, in expensive suits made to fit him, with silk ties and perfectly shined shoes. He was smooth when he needed to be, even charming. He could talk about boxing with Graciano, music with Sinatra, and Hollywood with Mansfield. He was the perfect picture of the classy gangster, the type of character that would later be shown in movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas. But under the champagne and cigars, under the beautiful women and the best tables and the best clubs, was a man that the police believed had killed somewhere between 40 and 50 people. Think about that for a minute. On a Tuesday night, Sonny might be laughing with Sammy Davis Jr. at the Copa, clapping for a show and giving big tips to waiters, acting like a perfect gentleman. On Wednesday morning, he might be in charge of a brutal beating, or worse, over a debt that was not paid. The same hands that shook hands with famous people were the same hands that, according to the police, had ended dozens of lives. This two-sided nature, this ability to live in two completely different worlds at the same time, was Sonny's special talent. He was not just a killer who happened to know famous people, nor was he just a nightclub regular who also had a criminal side job. He was fully both, all in one. He was a man who understood that violence and fancy living were not opposites in his world. They were two parts of the same lifestyle that went together. The mob's interest in entertainment was not just about hanging out with famous people. There was a lot of money to be made. Sonny Franzese was a leader in the mafias. Move into the entertainment business during the 1960s and 1970s. In 1967, Sonny got a share of Butter Records, a record company that would become one of the most successful independent companies of that time. On the outside, this seemed like a simple business investment, but the truth was much more complicated and much more illegal. Butter Records was used for money laundering, a way to take cash made from illegal things and turn it into money that looked like it came from a real business. The music business was perfect for this. Record sales, money from concerts, and deals to use songs made large amounts of cash that were hard to track. Money could come in and out without making people ask too many questions, especially if the right people were asking those questions, or more importantly, not asking them. But Sonny and his friends were not happy with just using the record company to wash money. They actively changed what music got played on the radio through payola, the illegal practice of paying DJs and radio stations to play certain songs. Even though payola had been made illegal in 1960, the practice kept happening through the decade and later, and organized crime was very involved. The result was that Butter Records had a series of hit songs in the late 1960s and early 1970s, like Yummy, Yummy, Yummy by the Ohio Express, Green Tambourine by the Lemon Pipers, and many other sweet pop songs climbed the music charts. They made millions of dollars and helped make Buddha a big company in the music business. Behind those simple pop songs was mob money, mob power, and mob control. Sonny's involvement in the entertainment business did not stop with music. In the early 1970s, he supposedly helped pay for two movies that would become very important for very different reasons. Deep Throat, 1972, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Deep Throat was a dirty movie that became a huge hit, making over $100 to $150 million in 1970s. Money all over the world. Even though it was only shown in a few theaters and had an X rating, the movie was made for about $25,000, making it one of the most profitable movies ever made. The mob's involvement in pornography was well known at this time, as adult movies were another perfect way to wash money and make huge amounts of cash. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, on the other hand, was a horror movie that would become one of the most important movies of its kind, while it made a lot less money than Deep Throat when it first came out. The movie was made for less than $140,000 and would end up making over $30 million. Its effect on culture was much bigger than the money it made. The movie's director, Tobe Hooper, would later talk about how hard it was to get money for the project and the different people who invested in it, though how much the mob was involved has been argued over the years. Whether Sonny was really involved in these movies is less important than what it shows. The Mafia's hands reached into every corner of the entertainment business during this time, from sweet pop music to pornography to independent horror movies. Organized crime found ways to invest money, make profits, and keep power over a business that seemed on the outside to be very far from the streets of Brooklyn. For Sonny, these entertainment investments were just another part of a wide-ranging criminal business. He was a businessman, but one whose business plan included murder, threats, and cheating, along with record deals and movie financing. Behind every public person is a private life, and Sonny Franzese's personal life was as complicated as his work life. He was married young to his first wife and had 3 children. But like many parts of Sonny's life, the story gets a lot more interesting when you look under the surface. During the best of his Copacabana years, Sonny got involved with Cristina Capobianco, a 16-year-old girl who sold cigarettes at the Stork Club, another famous nightclub in Manhattan. The relationship led to Cristina getting pregnant, a situation that could have created a huge scandal and legal problems for Sonny. The solution the family came up with was both smart and mean. Cristina was quickly married to a man named Frank Grillo, which covered up the pregnancy and gave the child a legal father on paper. On February 18, 1951, Michael Franzese was born. For years, Michael grew up thinking Frank Grillo was his real father. Eventually, the truth came out, and the mob came up with another solution. Sonny was allowed to divorce his first wife. Divorce was somewhat unusual in Italian-American Catholic families of that time, but not impossible when you had the right connections. And Frank Grillo, he mysteriously disappeared. What happened to him was never officially figured out, but it was strongly believed by those who knew the mob's ways of solving problems. Sonny married Cristina Capobianco, making their relationship and his connection to Michael legal. Together, they would have 4 more children, making Sonny's total number of children 8. Eventually, he would have 18 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. It was a large family that showed the normal home side of a very violent man. Michael Franzese, who was once the secret son, would grow up to be very smart and wanted to achieve great things. Sonny, even though he had not finished school himself, saw his son's smarts and told him to try for success in a legal way. Michael started a program to become a doctor at Hofstra University. And for a while, it seemed like he might be the Franzese who would escape the criminal life and find success in a legal way. But fate and family duty had other plans for Michael Franzese, plans that would eventually lead him deep into the group his father served. By 1963, Sonny Franzese had proven himself to be one of the best and most trusted members of the group. His crews made a huge amount of money. His discipline was perfect. His willingness to handle the family's most unpleasant jobs, including violence when needed, never wavered. And most importantly, he had never given the bosses any reason to doubt his loyalty. That year, Joseph Colombo, who had taken over as leader of the family from Joe Profaki, promoted Sonny to underboss, second in command of the entire Colombo crime family. This promotion made Sonny one of the most powerful gangsters in New York, which was one of the 5 most powerful mob families in America. As underboss, Sonny's duties grew a lot. He was no longer just managing his own crews. He was helping to watch over the entire family's business. He was involved in making big decisions, solving arguments, and deciding who got which areas and businesses. He was the boss's right-hand man, the one who enforced the family's rules, and the link between the street-level soldiers and the top leaders. The amount of money moving through Sonny's businesses during this time was huge. His bookmaking businesses alone were making millions of dollars every year. Bookmaking, which is taking bets on sports games, horse races, and other gambling, was one of organized crime's most dependable ways to make money. The house always had an advantage. Debts were collected with mean efficiency, and there were always new customers as gambling addicts tried to win back their losses. Sonny's loan sharking business was just as his profitable. Police would later describe him as the fastest growing and most prominent Shylock in greater New York. Loan sharking, lending money at crazy high interest rates to people who could not get loans in legal ways, was another mob specialty. Desperate people needed money for all sorts of reasons: gambling debts, drug habits, business problems, or medical emergencies. Sonny and his crew were happy to give them that money, usually at interest rates of 5% per week or higher. If you fell behind on payments, the interest grew quickly. If you continued to fall behind, collectors would visit, first with warnings, then with violence. Sonny also specialized in taking over nightclubs and bars by scaring the owners. The method was simple: find a successful place, have his helpers start causing problems like fights and property damage to scare away customers, and then offer protection from these problems for a share of the business or regular payments. Often, the ownership would eventually be completely handed over, giving the mob control of a real business that could be used for money laundering, as a meeting place, or simply as another way to make money. By the mid-1960s, Sonny Franzese was at the very top of his power. He had respect, money, a high position, and a reputation. He was living the dream that he first imagined as a young man watching the successful gangsters walk through his Brooklyn neighborhood. He had become one of them. No, he had become one of the most successful of them. But success in organized crime is always shaky. The same ambition and violence that build empires also get attention from the police, from rivals, and eventually from death itself. The higher Sonny climbed, the more people were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Behind the expensive suits and famous friends, behind the successful businesses and the family man image, was the violence. Always the violence. Police believed that Sonny Franzese had killed or ordered the murders of between 40 and 50 people during his criminal career. Let that number sink in for a moment. Not 4 or 5, Not even 10 or 20. 40 to 50 human beings whose lives ended because Sonny Franzese decided they needed to die. Some of these murders were business decisions, getting rid of rivals, silencing snitches, and punishing those who had broken mob rules. Some may have been personal. Some may have been ordered by higher-ups in the group. But no matter the reasons, the result was the same. Bodies, lots of them, scattered across decades. In 1964, Sonny was charged with the murder of Ernest Rupolo, a snitch for the Genovese family whose words had sent many gangsters to jail. Rupolo had been shot, stabbed, and dunked in Jamaica Bay. His body, weighed down with concrete blocks, was supposed to disappear forever. But bodies have a way of showing up. And when Rupolo's body was found, police began building a case against several people, including Sonny Franzese. The trial happened, but the result was never really in question. Witnesses suddenly had memory problems. Evidence became weak that the jury found Sonny not guilty. In organized crime. They called this kind of result the power of the family, the ability to scare witnesses, bribe officials, and cheat the justice system to protect its members. Sonny walked free. Another win in his long list of avoided punishments. According to later stories, Sonny had supposedly committed his first murder at age 14. If true, this means he had been killing for about 70 years by the time of his last arrest. 3/4 of a century of violence, starting when most boys are worried about homework, baseball, and first crushes. Perhaps the scariest were the details that would come out years later about Sonny's favorite ways of getting rid of bodies. In a conversation it was secretly recorded in 2006. Sonny supposedly described his method: cut up the body in a kiddie pool to contain the mess, microwave the body parts to break down the material, then feed the pieces through a garbage disposal. The casual way he described this method, the businesslike, almost scientific approach to murder, shows a mind that had long ago stopped seeing victims as people and started seeing them as problems to be solved with the most skill and the least evidence. This was not the work of a man who killed in a fit of anger, or even in a cold business decision. This was the work of someone who had turned murder into a factory process, who had perfected it, who had killed so many times that getting rid of the body had become a simple matter of steps rather than a heavy moral issue. Making people disappear was Sonny's specialty. Over the decades, how many bodies were gotten rid of this way? How many people simply vanished, leaving their families to wonder, their cases eventually going cold, and their killers never facing justice? We will never know the full number, but we know it was a lot. The violence was not just common. It was precise, planned, and completely heartless. Sonny Franzese was not a thug who got into bar fights and sometimes killed someone in the heat of the moment. He was a professional killer who did his work with the same care that a surgeon might use in an operation or an accountant might use on a tax return. The violence was his craft, improved over decades and perfected through practice. By the mid-1960s, the police had finally had enough. For decades, organized crime had operated mostly without punishment, protected by crooked officials, fear, and the simple difficulty of building cases against disciplined criminal groups that kept strict codes of silence. But times were changing. Federal law enforcement was becoming smarter, more determined, and more willing to use a lot of resources to take down major organized crime figures. Sonny Franzese, because of his position and the size of his businesses, was a main target. In late 1964, the New York State Investigation Commission targeted Sonny specifically, calling him to testify about criminal threats and illegal money-making activities in Suffolk County. This was a common trick: bring gangsters before investigating groups, force them to either talk and get themselves or others in trouble, or refuse to talk and face charges for not cooperating. Sonny, as usual, used his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 18 times during the hearing. For every question about his activities, his friends, and his knowledge of criminal activities, 18 times he answered with the legal version of silence. The Fifth Amendment was a tool that organized. Crime defendants used a lot, and Sonny used it like an expert. But the hearing did something that changed Sonny's position. It made him a public figure. A photo from the hearing was printed in the New York Daily News. Suddenly, Sonny was not just a secret figure that people whispered about in certain neighborhoods. He had a face, a name, and a connection to organized crime that was now a public fact. In March 1966, Sonny was charged for using threats in a huge bookmaking operation that was making about $10 million per year. $10 million? Dollars in 1966 is about $90 million in 2024 money. This was not small-time street gambling. This was a giant operation, and federal authorities were building their case piece by piece, subpoena by subpoena, and witness by witness. In April 1966, the FBI arrested Sonny Franzese. A federal grand jury had charged him as the leader of a smart bank robbery gang. The charges were serious and many. According to the charges, Sonny had planned the robbery of 4 banks and loan offices across the country. These were not clumsy smash-and-grab jobs. They were carefully planned operations targeting places in New York, Massachusetts, and Utah. The gang had stolen over $65,000, which is about $600,000 in today's money, a large amount, but not huge by modern standards. The investigation had been long and complex. The FBI had tracked the gang's movements, identified the members, and traced the money. They had built what they believed was a perfect case, linking Sonny to the planning of these robberies. Even though he had never personally entered a bank with a gun, this charge showed a change in how the police were dealing with organized crime. Instead of focusing only on traditional mob businesses like gambling and loan sharking, they were connecting major figures to a wider range of criminal activities. The message was clear. We're coming after you from every angle, building cases wherever we can, and we're not going to stop. In March 1967, Sonny was found guilty in federal court. In Albany, New York. Judge Jacob Mishler, who would later become a well-known federal judge, was in charge of the trial. The jury found Sonny guilty of being the mastermind behind the robberies. For Sonny Franzese, who had avoided serious trouble for decades, the walls were finally closing in. In 1970, Judge Mishler sentenced Sonny Franzese to 50 years in federal prison. This was a sentence so long that it was basically a life sentence for a man in his early 50s. According to many stories, Sonny supposedly looked at Judge Mishler and said, "You watch, I'm going to do the whole 50. Most people watching would have thought this was just brave talk or denial. Sonny was 53 years old at the time he was sentenced. 50 years would make him 103 years old, an age so unlikely it seems silly to even talk about. The average life expectancy for American men in 1970 was around 67 years. For criminals serving hard time in federal prison, the chances of reaching such an old age were very, very small. But Sonny Franzese was not most people. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the oldest and most famous federal prisons in the country. Leavenworth had held some of America's most dangerous criminals, and it was where the federal government sent prisoners they wanted to make sure would not escape and would be kept under tight control. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, in his yearly report showing the FBI's major successes of 1967, specifically listed Sonny Franzese's conviction. For Hoover, this represented everything he wanted the FBI to be: professional, determined, and able to take down major organized crime figures. The conviction was a message to the mob: no one is untouchable. No matter how powerful, no matter how disciplined, no matter how connected. While Sonny was in jail, his nephew Salvatore took over managing the family's gambling businesses. The business continued. As it always did in organized crime, no one is truly someone who cannot be replaced. The group adjusts, promotes from within, and continues making money. But even behind bars, even away from his crews, his territory, and his businesses, Sonny Franzese never stopped being a boss. He stayed in touch, got updates, and passed messages through careful ways that the feds could lock up his body. But they could not lock up his reputation or his power. In 1978, after serving 8 years of his 50-year sentence, Sonny Franzese was released on parole. He was 61 years old, an age when most people are thinking about retirement, grandchildren, and quiet golden years. Sonny Franzese had other plans. The problem with letting a lifelong criminal out on parole, especially one as dedicated as Sonny, is that they do not suddenly become law-abiding citizens just because they have been released from prison. Organized crime is not a job you retire from. It is a way of life, a part of who you are, and a community. Everyone you know, every connection you have, and every skill you have learned, all of it is part of that world. The rules of Sonny's parole were clear. He was not allowed to hang out with known criminals. For a made man in the Colombo family, this rule was almost silly. His entire group of friends, his business partners, and his family members, many of them, were involved in organized crime in some way. Following the exact words of this parole rule would mean being completely alone. Sonny did not follow it. Within a few years, he was caught meeting with other gangsters in public. In 1982, his parole was taken away, and he was sent back to prison. This would become a pattern that would repeat itself over the next few decades. He would be released on parole, break the rules by meeting with mob friends, have his parole taken away, go back to prison, get released eventually, and the cycle would start all over again. He was released in 1984, only to break parole again. Over the years, Sonny would break parole at least 6 times, and probably more. Each time he broke the rules, it was written down. There were photographs of him sitting in restaurants with known gangsters and security camera videos of him entering clubs where organized crime members hung out. There was testimony from police officers who had seen these meetings. Why could he not stop? The simple answer is that he did not want to stop. For Sonny Franzese, being a gangster was not just what he did. It was who he was. The idea of cutting off contact with the group he had served for decades, the people he had known his whole adult life, was something he could not imagine. He would rather go back to prison than live as a normal person. The FBI and other police agencies watched and wrote down every time he broke the rules, building their cases, sending him back to prison, releasing him again, and starting the cycle all over. It was a strange dance, repeated over and over. Sonny would get out, go back to his old life, get caught, and go back inside. Each time he was older. Each time people thought he would not survive another sentence. Each time he proved everyone wrong. By the 1980s and 1990s, most of Sonny's old friends, the men he had started with in the 1940s and 1950s, were dead. Some had been killed in mob fights. Others had died from heart attacks, cancer, or other sicknesses that take men in their 70s and 80s. Still others were serving life, sentences they would never get out of, dying in prison cells far from their families and the streets they had once ruled. Sonny Franzese was still working into his 70s. Then his 80s. Sonny stayed active in organized crime. This had never happened before. Most gangsters who lived to be old did so in retirement, either forced out by younger members or choosing to step back and enjoy their last years. The life was for young men. Men with energy, a scary physical presence, and many years ahead of them to build their reputations and empires. But Sonny was different. His reputation carried him. The stories of what he had done, who he had killed, and how he had never broken, these stories created a special feeling around him that went beyond his getting older. Sonny Franzese entered a room. Even in his 70s and 80s, people noticed that they showed respect. They remembered who he was and what he stood for. Amazingly, between his release in 1978 and his final arrest in 2008, Sonny was never charged with new crimes. Only parole violations. This is very unusual for someone actively involved in organized crime. It suggests either that Sonny was very careful and disciplined, or maybe that younger gangsters realized that having Sonny around was valuable enough, that they were careful to keep him away from activities that might bring police attention. The question everyone in law, enforcement, and organized crime circles kept asking was, how is this man still alive? Organized crime is a young man's game, and it is a violent one. The average life expectancy of a made man, especially one as high-ranking and active as Sonny had been, was much lower than for the general population. Violence, stress, drug and alcohol abuse, and prison conditions, all of these things usually killed gangsters long before they reached their 80s. Yet here was Sonny, surviving when he should not have, beating the odds, refusing to die, refusing to retire, and refusing to fade away. In 2005, something amazing happened. Sonny Franzese, at the age of 88, was made underboss of the Colombo crime family again. This was 42 years after his first time as underboss. From 1963 to 1967, the decision to promote an 88-year-old man to the second highest job in the family might seem silly at first. What could an 88-year-old do for a criminal group that required physical intimidation, day-to-day management of multiple crews, and the energy to handle the demands of leadership? But the promotion made perfect sense when you understood what the Colombo family needed at that moment. The family had been torn apart by fights inside the group, struggles for leadership, and damaging court cases. Younger members are more and more willing to work with the police, breaking the code of Omerta that had once been holy. The family needed a symbol, someone who represented the old ways, the old code, the time when being a made man meant something. Sonny Franzese was that symbol. His promotion was not about day-to-day work or closely managing crews. It was about giving his reputation, his trustworthiness, and his perfect example of old-school mafia values to a family that was in danger of losing what it stood for. When Sonny spoke, people listened, not just because of his title, but because of his history, because of everything he represented. And amazingly, even in his late 80s, Sonny was still physically impressive. He took care of himself, stayed active, and carried himself like a man who had been respected for 70 years. When he entered a room, even though he was decades older than everyone else there was no doubt about his authority. Into his 90s, Sonny was involved in forcing Manhattan strip clubs, like the Hustler Club and the Penthouse Club, to pay him. These fancy places that made a lot of cash were forced to pay the Colombo family, and Sonny received his share. He was also involved in forcing a Long Island pizza place to pay him and in running loan sharking businesses. Think about that for a moment. A man in his 90s, an age when most people struggle with basic daily tasks, was still actively forcing businesses to pay him, collecting debts, And managing criminal operations. Age was just a number. Fear was timeless. And Sonny Franzese's ability to create both respect and terror had not gotten smaller with the passing years. In 2006, Sonny Franzese made a mistake, perhaps his first serious mistake in decades of criminal activity. And in the modern time of advanced spying technology, one mistake was all it took. Sonny had a conversation with Gaetano Guy Furtado, a helper of the Colombo family. They talked about different things, business, the old days, and different methods. It was the kind of conversation Sonny had probably had thousands of times over the decades. Just shop talk between criminals. It was the casual discussion of murder and chaos that happens when people who have spent their lives in violence get together. What Sonny did not know was that Furtado was a government informant wearing a secret recording device. On that recording, Sonny described his favorite method for getting rid of bodies: the kiddie pool, the microwave, and the garbage disposal technique that he had apparently perfected over decades. He discussed forcing strip clubs to pay him. He talked about the business in a way that was detailed, specific, and completely got him in trouble. For a man who had kept Omerta for over 70 years, who had never given the police anything they could use against him or anyone else, this was a terrible mistake. The recording was clear, detailed, and in Sonny's own voice. There would be no claiming it was someone else. No arguing about whether a witness could be trusted. No scaring people into changing their stories. The tape was the tape, and it said what it said. After 70 years of successfully avoiding punishment for murder, after keeping perfect discipline and silence through countless questionings and investigations, technology had finally caught Sonny Franzese. It was not a snitch's story that could be challenged, not evidence that could be explained away, but his own words recorded for all time, describing crimes in detail that left no room for doubt. A secret recording represented everything that had changed about law enforcement over Sonny's long career. In the 1950s and 1960s, when he was first building his reputation, spying technology was pretty simple. Bugs were large and easy to find. Recording devices needed a lot of equipment. Informants had to rely on their memories and notes, which could be challenged in court. By 2006, a wire could be impossibly small, incredibly clear, and completely reliable. The technology had changed faster than the old gangster's ability to adapt. Men like Sonny, who had learned their skills in an earlier time, were not ready for a world where any conversation at any time might be recorded and used against them. The situation was very ironic. After a lifetime of staying silent, of never admitting to anything, of being the perfect example of Omerta, Sonny Franzese was finally brought down by his own voice. While Sonny was dealing with the challenges of his 90s, his son Michael had been writing his own chapter in the Franzese family story, one that would be both similar to and different from his father's path. Michael Franzese, the son born in secret and hidden by a fake father, had eventually been pulled into the life that Sonny had hoped he would avoid. Even though his father wanted him to get a real job after his pre-med studies at Hofstra, Michael was drawn into the family business. Maybe it was bound to happen. Perhaps the pull of family, of who he was, and of proving himself to the father he had only recently learned was his real parent, was too strong to resist. Michael rose quickly in the Colombo family, showing a smartness and business skill that was even better than his father's. He became a capo, or captain, with his own crew and created businesses that were incredibly profitable, even by mob standards. In 1986, Fortune magazine listed Michael Franzese as number 18 on their list of the 50 most wealthy and powerful mafia bosses. For a man still in his 30s, this was an amazing achievement. Michael claimed that at his peak, he was making up to $8 million per week through his various businesses. His specialty was a gasoline tax cheating plan, a brilliant operation that used a weakness in how different states taxed fuel. The plan involved buying gasoline, selling it without paying the required taxes, and keeping the difference. The operation needed smart coordination between multiple fake companies. But when done right, it made huge profits with very little risk of violent fights. Michael's criminal career, like his father's, eventually caught up with him. In 1986, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for conspiracy. He was released in 1989, broke parole, went back in 1991, and was finally released in 1994. But unlike his father, Michael Franzese made a choice that Sonny never would. He cooperated with the FBI. Michael's cooperation was unusual. He admitted to his own crimes, but refused to testify against other gangsters in court. This put him in a strange middle ground. He had broken Omerta by talking to federal agents, but he had not done what informants usually do: take the witness stand and send other gangsters to prison. In the mob's eyes, this might have been the worst of both worlds, betraying the code without even getting full credit for cooperation. Michael walked away from organized crime completely. He became a born-again Christian, got married, started a family, and changed himself into a motivational speaker and author. He wrote books about his experiences, gave talks about leaving the mob life, and built a successful legal career based on being a former gangster who got out. The relationship between Michael and Sonny during this time was complicated. Sonny was reportedly disappointed but not surprised. He understood that the life was not for everyone, that some men did not have the strength for it. But Michael's cooperation with the FBI, even in a limited way, must have hurt Sonny, who had stayed completely silent through everything. Later, it would be revealed that Sonny had once approved a plan to have Michael killed for leaving the life. Whether this order was serious or just for show, and whether it was ever actually tried, is not clear. But it shows how complex Sonny Franzese was. A man who could be a loving father at home and a ruthless enforcer on the street, who could feel real love and at the same time be willing to order violence, even against his own family. Michael would later describe his father as a chameleon, someone who could easily switch between being a loving family man and a hardened criminal, between a charming friend and a cold-blooded killer. This two-sided nature, this ability to keep parts of his life separate, was perhaps Sonny's most defining quality. While Michael Franzese had found a way out and built a new life, his brother John Franzese Jr. was drowning. John Jr. had always lived in the shadow of both his father and his more successful brother. Unlike Michael, John Jr. was never made. He remained a helper, someone who hung around the edges of the life without ever being fully accepted into its inner circle. In mob talk, he was a nobody, as Michael would later describe him. This must have been very painful for someone whose last name was so important in organized crime. But John Jr.'s problems went far beyond his status in the mob. He was an addict, using alcohol, cocaine, and crack. His life was spinning out of control. His health was getting worse, and his future was looking dim. And then he received another piece of terrible news. He was HIV positive, living with a disease that in the early 2000s still came with a lot of shame and serious health problems. John Jr. was a desperate man, and desperate men made choices that they might not otherwise make. In 2000, facing drug charges and the possibility of serious prison time, John Jr. made a decision that would break his family apart and go against every rule he had been raised to respect. He began cooperating with the FBI. His first cooperation was selfish, a way to avoid punishment and protect himself. But there was another reason. one that was perhaps more understandable. He was trying to protect his mother, Christina. By this point, Christina had grown tired of the mob life, tired of the constant fear, the arrests, and the years of being apart. While Sonny was in prison, she wanted out. She wanted a normal life, and John Jr. saw cooperation as a way to help her escape the shadows that had defined their family for generations. When journalist Jerry Capezzi broke the story that John Franzese Jr. was a snitch, it sent shockwaves through the Colombo family and the wider organized crime world. The Franzese name meant loyalty, Omerta, and never breaking. And now a Franzese. Sonny's own son was cooperating with the feds. The FBI's informant was not just gathering general information about organized crime. John Jr. was providing specific, useful information about his own father. On Thanksgiving in 2000, based on tips from John Jr., Sonny Franzese was arrested for breaking parole. He was sent back to prison, another one in the long series of parole violations that had marked his life after 1978. But this time was different. This time, Sonny did not know that his own son had betrayed him. The family broke apart along expected lines. Christina, tired of decades as a mob wife, sided with John Gr. She had separated from Sonny, had had enough of the life, and wanted to protect herself and her son. For her, John Jr.'s cooperation might have seemed like the only way to finally break free from the strong pull of Sonny's criminal life. Michael was caught in the middle, sad about his brother's choice, but still loving him. He understood the desperation that had led to this moment, but also knew the size of the betrayal. The Franzese family, which had survived so much over the decades, was now at war with itself. For Sonny, learning that his son was an informant must have been one of the most painful moments of his long life. He had survived prison, violence, and betrayal from strangers and friends, but having his own flesh and blood break Omerta, having his own son provide information that sent him back to prison, and having the Franzese name linked with cooperation rather than loyalty, this was a wound that went deeper than any physical injury he had ever gotten over his 80 years of crime. In 2008, at the age of 91, Sonny Franzese was arrested again. The charges were serious: forcing Manhattan strip clubs and a Long Island pizza place to pay him, and running loan sharking operations. These were major federal charges that, given Sonny's age and criminal history, could lead to a sentence that would almost certainly be his last. John Franzese Jr. agreed to do something that had never been done before in New York's organized crime history: testify against his own father in court. Sons had cooperated with law enforcement before. They had provided information, worn wires, and given statements. But no mafia son had ever taken the witness stand in a courtroom and testified against his father in front of a jury. This was crossing a line that even most informants were afraid to cross. The trial began on June 9, 2010, at the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. It was a huge media event. Press called Sonny the Nodfather because the 93-year-old defendant kept falling asleep during the trial. Defense lawyers tried to use this to their advantage, painting Sonny as a weak old man who belonged in a nursing home, not in federal prison. How could this elderly man, who could not even stay awake during his own trial, be a threat to anyone? But John Jr. had a different message for the jury. Do not be fooled by his weak appearance. He knew what his father was capable of, knew the violence that was hidden under the surface of the elderly man nodding off in court. The situation in the courtroom was very strange. Here was a 93-year-old man, sometimes sleeping, often seeming confused, sitting at the defense table in a yellow shirt, and on the witness stand was his son, testifying about his father's criminal activities. describing the businesses, the extortion, and the culture of violence that had defined their family for generations. "He's sitting there in the yellow shirt," John Jr. said when asked to identify his father. It was a moment of brutal simplicity. A son pointing out his father, getting ready to send him to prison, possibly for the rest of his life. They barely looked at each other during the trial. What was there to say? The betrayal was complete and public. The press was, covering every moment. The jury was watching every interaction. This was the ultimate family drama playing out in the most public way possible. During his testimony, John Jr. revealed personal details that explained his decision to cooperate. He admitted on the stand that he had HIV and that he had been walking around without treatment for 3 years because he could not afford proper medical care. The defense suggested that his testimony was for money, that the FBI was helping pay for his treatment, and that he was selling out his father for money and medical care. John Jr. admitted that he was receiving $100 per week for expenses from the L.A. County Sheriff's Office as part of witness protection. It was not a lot of money, hardly enough to make up for what he had lost in terms of family, identity, and safety. But the defense used it to suggest he was doing it for money, trying to make the jury not believe him. The prosecution played the tapes, Sonny's own voice, discussing criminal activities, describing ways to get rid of bodies, and confirming he was involved in extortion. The evidence was very strong, not just from John Jr.'s testimony, but from Sonny's own words. During a break in the trial, Sonny went to the courthouse bathroom. His separated wife, Christina Tina Capobianco Franzese, followed him in. Witnesses outside the bathroom heard screaming, a full-blown argument between husband and wife in the courthouse restroom. According to reports, Tina supposedly slapped the underboss, who was in a wheelchair. Decades of frustration and anger boiled over in that moment. "I never beat you. Your mother beat you," Tina yelled, apparently defending her parenting while attacking Sonny's. "I just want to go to the bathroom," Sonny reportedly answered. It was perhaps the most human moment in the entire trial. An old man facing life in prison, betrayed by his son, just wanting to use the bathroom in peace. Later, speaking to the press, Tina made her position clear. He should plead guilty and give his son a break. But Sonny would not plead. Omerta was more than just never snitching on others. It meant never admitting guilt, never giving the government the satisfaction of a confession, and never bowing, even when defeat was certain. Sonny had kept this position for over 70 years, and he was not going to break now, not even for his son, not even at 93 years old, not even when the evidence against him was overwhelming. The headlines screamed things like, "Rats! My boy!" The tabloid press had a great time with the Mafia family drama. For Sonny, whose reputation had been built on loyalty and silence, having his own son called a rat in public was perhaps more painful than any prison sentence. According to reports, Sonny promised to have John Jr. murdered for his betrayal. We cannot know for sure if this was serious or just the expected response from a gangster whose son had testified against him, or if Sonny actually had the connections and power to carry out such a plan, or if it was an empty threat from a broken old man. But the promise was reported, adding another layer of sadness to an already terrible family situation. On January 14, 2011, the jury came back with its decision. Guilty. Sonny Franzese, at 94 years old, was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. For a man his age, suffering from kidney disease, heart problems, and high blood pressure, this sentence was basically a death penalty. No one expected him to survive it. The Federal Bureau of Prisons had never had such an elderly prisoner. The medical care needed, the special arrangements required. It seemed impossible that Sonny would live to be free again. He became the oldest federal prisoner in the United States, a title that showed the strange nature of his situation. Here was a man who should have been in a care home for the dying, who by any normal measure should have been spending his final days with family and comfort. Instead, he was being sent to federal prison, possibly to die behind bars, brought down finally by his own son's testimony and his own recorded words. The conviction represented the end of an era in many ways. Sonny Franzese was the last active underboss from the Mafia's golden age. He was the final living link to the post-World War II mob, to the time when organized crime had huge power and influence, when the code of Omerta was sacred, and when being a made man meant something important. His conviction, partly because of his son's testimony, showed how much had changed. Old codes were breaking down. Family loyalty no longer came before saving yourself. Mob that Sonny had joined in 1950 no longer existed in any real way. It had been destroyed by RICO cases filled with informants, and weakened by members who chose cooperation over death or long prison sentences. As Sonny was led away to begin his sentence, death seemed certain, but death had never been able to get Sonny Franzese before, and against all odds, it would not get him this time either. Against every medical prediction, every life expectancy chart, and every reasonable expectation, Sonny Franzese survived federal prison. The federal prison system had never seen anything like it. They had elderly prisoners before, but none close to Sonny's age. They had to create special plans for his medical care, his food needs, and his basic daily life. Sonny needed medications, regular medical checks, and help with tasks that younger prisoners handled on their own. But he survived. Age 95, age 96, age 97. Each birthday was a small miracle, a challenge to nature, and numbers. Age 98, age 99. Other prisoners, guards, and prison officials watched in something close to amazement as this ancient man simply refused to die. On June 23, 2017, something amazing happened. Sonny Franzese was released from federal prison at the age of 100. He had served 6 years of his 8-year sentence, with time off for good behavior. We guess, though, the idea of good behavior for a convicted organized crime underboss is hard to imagine. The Bureau of Prisons had likely realized that keeping a 100-year-old in jail served no useful purpose and created big medical and legal problems. Sonny Franzese became the oldest federal prisoner ever released. It was a record that would likely never be broken, a number so strange that it was hard to believe. He returned to Brooklyn, moving into his daughter's home. Photos from this time show a weak but upright man smiling for the cameras, still holding some of the pride that had defined him for so many decades. He had beaten the system again. The 50-year sentence he received in 1970, the 8-year sentence from 2011, and the many predictions of his death. He had outlived them all. John Franzese Jr., meanwhile, had been living in the witness protection program, moved to a new place with a new name, separated from everything and everyone he had known. But witness protection is a difficult life. Lonely, scared, always looking over your shoulder, and living with a fake name. In 2017, someone recognized John Jr. at a recovery meeting. His cover was blown on Facebook, revealed in the most modern of ways through social media. The FBI told him to move immediately, to get back underground to protect himself from possible revenge. John Jr. refused. He was living under the name Matt Pazzarelli now, and he had apparently decided that the life of constant hiding was not worth living. If they wanted to find him, they would find him. He was done running. Then, in 2019, something happened that nobody expected. John Jr. visited the nursing home where Sonny was living, and father and son made up. What was said in that meeting? What words could possibly fill the huge gap that had opened between them? How do you make up after a betrayal that big? How does a father forgive a son who testified against him? How does a son ask for forgiveness from a father who had promised to have him killed? Only Sonny and John Jr. know what happened in that room, but they found some kind of peace, some way to be father and son again, despite everything. After the trial, the conviction, the public shame, and the breaking of their family, they came together in Sonny's final years. Michael Franzese, who had kept relationships with both his father and his brother through all this, later revealed something that added another layer to the family's complex story. Sonny had once approved an order to have Michael killed for leading the mob life. Michael explained, "My father was a chameleon. At home, a loving father and husband, but on the street, a hardcore guy who never had regrets. Never would admit to any crime, never give anybody up, never violate his oath." This description captured the main truth of Sonny Franzese. He was not simply a violent criminal who pretended to be a good family man, nor was he a family man who happened to be involved in crime. He was truly both, fully dedicated to his family while being equally dedicated to a life that included murder, extortion, and complete loyalty to the mob. The contradictions could not be solved because they were not really contradictions in Sonny's mind. They were different situations requiring different behaviors, and he moved between them smoothly. In his final years, Sonny Franzese did something he had rarely done in over 90 years. He talked. He agreed to be interviewed by Newsday reporter S.J. Pitts. After 9 decades of keeping Omerta, after 70 years of refusing to discuss his crimes, after a lifetime of silence, why talk now? At 102 years old, knowing that the end was near, perhaps Sonny wanted his story told his own way. The interviews became the basis for an official biography. Sonny, the last of the old-time mafia bosses, John Sonny Franzese. In the book, Sonny revealed secrets and stories that had been hidden for decades. He discussed the glamorous years at the Copacabana, his relationships with celebrities, the setup and business of the Colombo family, and the code he lived by. But even at 102, even in what he knew were likely his final interviews, Sonny did not admit to specific murders. To the very end, he would discuss the life, the culture, and the general way things were done, but he would not give law enforcement or history a satisfaction of specific confessions. Some secrets, he decided, would go with him to the grave. The biography was an amazing document, a window into a world and a time that had mostly disappeared. Sonny represented a direct link to the Mafia's golden age, and his memories, even when filtered to make himself look better and with some things left out, gave us a look into how that world actually worked. On February 24th, 2020, in a New York City hospital, Sonny Franzese died of natural causes. He was 103 years and 18 days old. He was one of the longest living gangsters in history, possibly the longest living. He was surrounded by family in his final moments. The family he had both protected and endangered, loved and betrayed, provided for and damaged. The man who had cut up bodies in kiddie pools died peacefully in bed. His death, as natural and ordinary as his life, had been amazing and violent. He had outlived them all. The bosses he had served, the men he had killed, the snitches who had tried to bring him down, and the police who had chased him for decades. He had even outlived his own son's testimony, walking out of prison at 100 to live 3 more years in freedom, in a job where most members died young and violently, where the average career ended in prison or a shallow grave. Sonny Franzese reached 103. He had received a 50-year sentence in 1970, and in a darkly funny way, had almost finished it. Not by serving the time all at once, but by living long enough that the years added up. On February 28, 2020, Sonny's funeral was held in Brooklyn. The question on everyone's mind was, would John Jr. attend? After everything, the testimony, the betrayal, the public show, would the son show his face at his father's funeral? He did. Father and son had made up, and John Jr. came to pay his respects, to say goodbye to the complicated, contradictory, terrifying, and charming man who had been his father. The last of the old school gangsters was laid to rest. An era ended, the last living link to the Mafia's golden age, the final example of Omerta, the man who had refused to die, had finally accepted what every human must eventually accept. The life of John Sonny Franzese can be measured in numbers, though numbers alone cannot show how complex his life was. 103 years lived. From World War I to the COVID-19 pandemic, from a world of horse-drawn carriages to smartphones and social media. 8 decades in organized crime. From the late 1930s to 2017, longer than most people's entire lives. Over 30 years spent in prison in total. Time spread across multiple sentences, jail stays, and parole violations. A 50-year sentence given in 1970, serving only parts of it before being released, rearrested, and re-released in a cycle that defined his later years. At least 6 documented parole violations, probably more. Each one a refusal to live by rules that did not match who he was. 40 to 50 people murdered, as estimated by the police, with bodies that were never found, families that never got answers, and lives ended by Sonny's decision or on his orders. 8 children, 18 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, a family legacy that exists alongside his criminal legacy, with complicated relationships that mixed real love with the pain of mob life. He was made a made man at 33, which was relatively late by Mafia standards. But he made up for lost time. He was Underboss twice, from 1963 to 1967, and again from 2005 to 2007, something that had never happened before, serving in that role 4 decades apart. He was the oldest federal prisoner ever, a record that speaks to both his long life and his inability or unwillingness to leave the life. He was the first New York mob son to testify against his father, as John Jr.'s testimony broke a rule that even most snitches respected. These numbers tell a story, but they are not complete. They do not show the fear Sonny created, the respect he received, the code he lived by, or the contradictions he represented. Omerta. The word itself is Sicilian and means humility or manliness. But in Mafia culture, it means something much more specific: absolute silence, complete loyalty, and the willingness to suffer and die rather than cooperate with the police or betray the group. For Sonny Franzese, Omerta was not just a rule. It was who he was. Throughout his life, he followed this code more completely than perhaps any other gangster of his time. He was arrested many times, served decades in prison, and faced the ultimate betrayal of his son testifying against him. And he never broke, even when the secret recording caught him discussing crimes, even when the evidence was overwhelming. Sonny would not plead guilty. He would not give the government the satisfaction. He would not admit to specific crimes. He would not give names or details that could be used against others. To the very end. Through his official biography and final interviews, he kept a wall of silence around the details of his crimes. This earned him a grudging respect, even from police officers who had spent their careers trying to take him down. They might have hated what he did, but they saw something like honor in how he did it. He was a stand-up guy in mob talk, someone who accepted the results of his actions without trying to blame others or make his own punishment lighter by getting others in trouble. What made Sonny different from the snitches? The cooperators? The men who cut deals to save themselves? Pride, certainly. Loyalty, perhaps, but also a basic belief that the code was what separated a made man from a common criminal. Anyone could commit. Crimes. What made you a member of Cosa Nostra was your willingness to live by rules that were more important than saving yourself. In modern times, when cooperation with the police has become almost normal among organized crime defendants, Sonny's complete refusal to break stands out even more. He represented something that has mostly disappeared. The belief that honor, no matter how twisted that honor might be, is worth suffering for. Michael Franzese's description of his father as a chameleon is perhaps the best way to understand Sonny's character. He was a man who could smoothly switch between different identities depending on the situation. At home, he was a loving father, there for his children's lives, supportive and kind. He attended family dinners, celebrated holidays, and showed real warmth toward his wife and kids. According to family members, this was not an act. Sonny genuinely loved his family and acted as a caring father at home. On the street, he was a ruthless killer, cold-blooded, calculating, and willing to order murders with the same casual ease that others might fire an employee. The violence was not done in anger or passion. It was professional, businesslike, and necessary in the world he lived in. At the Copacabana, he was a charming socialite, classy, entertaining, the kind of man that celebrities wanted at their table. He could discuss music, boxing, and movies. He had real friendships with famous people who likely knew or suspected what he did for a living, but chose to ignore it, or found it darkly interesting. As an underboss, he was a smart leader, making decisions that affected hundreds of people, managing complex criminal businesses, and balancing the different needs of different crews and families. Which one was the real Sonny? The question assumes that one version was real, while the others were masks. But this idea is probably wrong. All of these versions were real. Sonny did not have a true self that he hid behind different masks. He was genuinely all of these things at the same time, able to use different parts of his personality as the situation needed. This ability to separate different parts of his life and act the right way in each is often seen as a quality of successful criminals, especially those in leadership positions. You could not act as a loving father if you let yourself think about the violence you had committed. You could not carry out necessary violence if you let family feelings get in the way of business decisions. The ability to keep these worlds separate, to move between them without feeling conflicted, was key to Sonny's success and long life. But there was a price. His wife eventually left him. Tired of decades of mob life, his son testified against him. His other son fled the life completely. Separation of his life's parts that allowed Sonny to function also prevented him from putting these different parts together into a complete whole. He was many things to many people, but perhaps he was never fully known by anyone, not even by himself. Why does Sonny Franzese fascinate us? Why does his story grab our attention, even from people who are usually not interested in organized crime? Part of the answer is that Sonny represents a time we will never see again. The Mafia, as it existed during Sonny's prime from the 1950s through the 1980s, was a special thing in American history. It had huge power and influence, getting into legal businesses, bribing officials, and controlling entire industries. The mob was a secret government in many American cities, with its own rules, its own justice system, and its own levels of power. That world is gone now, destroyed by RICO cases, weakened by snitches, and also weakened by the simple fact that younger generations no longer feel they have to follow the old codes. The modern mob exists, but it is a weak shadow of what it once was. The glamour is gone. The power is less, and its effect on culture is small. Sonny Franzese was there when the Mafia meant something. He was there in the Copacabana years, when gangsters and celebrities mixed freely. He was there during the Five Families' peak power, when organized crime controlled much of New York's economy. He was there when Omerta was sacred, when being a made man gave you real status and respect. The movies and television shows about the mob, like The Godfather, Goodfellas, and The Sopranos, were based on men like Sonny, but the reality was always more complex, darker, and more contradictory than any made-up story could show. Sonny was not Don Corleone, noble and family-focused. He was not Henry Hill, charming and ultimately weak. He was not Tony Soprano, conflicted and worried. He was his own unique mix of violence, discipline, charm, ruthlessness, and long life. What makes Sonny's story especially interesting is the contradiction at its center, that he was an absolutely terrible human being by any normal moral standard. He killed dozens of people. He destroyed families, and he corrupted legal businesses. He lived a life defined by violence and crime. There is no way to make these facts seem romantic or to excuse them. And yet, within the twisted moral world of organized crime, he was a figure of honor. He lived by a code. No matter how wrong that code might be, he accepted punishments without complaint. He never broke his promise. He stayed loyal, even when it cost him a lot. In a world of betrayers and cooperators, he stood firm. This contradiction between being morally awful in the bigger picture while being admirable within his specific culture is what makes Sonny such a complex figure to judge. We can see that his loyalty and discipline were real good qualities, while at the same time knowing that he used these qualities to do monstrous things. Sonny's death closed a chapter in American criminal history. Men like him, with that combination of long life, discipline, and a complete commitment to Omerta, will not exist again. The world has changed, the mob has changed, the codes that defined Sonny's generation have been left behind by later generations who are more practical, more willing to cooperate, and less tied to tradition. He was quite literally the last immortal of the mob, not immortal in the sense of living forever, but immortal in the sense that his story will live on after him, that his name will be remembered long after the current generation of gangsters is forgotten. Sonny Franzese has become part of American folklore, a dark legend that represents both the romance and the horror of organized crime's golden age. There is something uniquely American about Sonny Franzese's story. He was the child of immigrants, born in the old country, but raised in Brooklyn, moving between two cultures and in the end, creating his own mixed identity. The Mafia, as it existed in America, was basically an American thing, different from its Sicilian origins, and shaped by American business, American values, however twisted, and American opportunities. Sonny's story is also a thought about loyalty and what it means in the normal world. Loyalty is generally seen as a good thing, being faithful to family, friends, beliefs, and groups. But Sonny's loyalty was to a group built on violence and crime. His following of Omerta meant staying silent about murders. His loyalty to the family meant putting it above his own biological family when there were problems. Can we call this a good quality when it is used for evil? The question of Sonny's intelligence also deserves to be thought about. He was clearly not a smart person in any normal sense. He dropped out of high school, never went to college, and spent his life in a world that valued physical courage and street smarts over school learning. And yet, he showed a smart understanding of people, how groups work, and how to survive that allowed him to do well in a very dangerous world for 8 decades. Think about what it took to survive. As long as Sonny did in organized crime, you had to be violent enough to be feared, but controlled enough not to get unnecessary attention. You had to be loyal, but not foolish about others' loyalty. You had to make money, but not be so greedy that you made others angry. You had to handle complex relationships, manage different interests, and avoid the many traps that caught most of your friends. Sonny did all of this for 70 years. That requires a form of intelligence that should not be ignored just because it was not used in classrooms or offices. The relationship between Sonny and his sons, especially the different paths of Michael and John Jr., shows how impossible it is to pass down things in the mob world. Sonny could not pass on his reputation, his discipline, or his complete commitment to the Nsa code. Each man had to find his own way and make his own choices. Michael found a path out and built a new life. John Jr. spiraled downward and in the end betrayed everything his father stood for. Neither son could simply be Sonny Franzese Jr., inheriting his father's position and reputation. The life does not work that way. There is also the question of Sonny's victims. The 40 to 50 people he supposedly killed, plus the countless others whose lives were destroyed by his extortion, loan sharking, and other criminal activities. These people are largely forgotten, nameless victims of mob violence. They had families who missed them and lives that were cut short or ruined. Any complete story of Sonny Franzese's life must include these victims and must admit that behind the fascinating story of long life and loyalty was an ocean of suffering that he caused. And yet, even after admitting all of this, even after seeing Sonny as a serial killer and career criminal, there remains something interesting about his story. Perhaps it is the sheer unlikeliness of his long life. Perhaps it is the look he gives use into a world that has largely disappeared. Perhaps it is the contradictions he represented: loving father and ruthless killer, charming socialite and cold-blooded criminal, loyal soldier and group leader. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps we are drawn to Sonny Franzese's story because he represents something basic about human nature: our ability to fully commit to chosen paths, no matter how destructive, and to keep that commitment across entire lifetimes. Sonny chose the mob life at a young age, and he never changed his mind about that choice. There is something almost admirable about that level of commitment, even when the thing being committed to is morally wrong. In the end, Sonny Franzese died the way he lived, on his own terms. He served time, but not nearly what he deserved. He faced betrayal, but found a way to make up. He lost much, but never broke. He lived 103 years in a job where most do not reach 60. He walked out of federal prison at age 100 and died peacefully 3 years later, surrounded by family. Was he a monster? Yes. Was he fascinating? Absolutely. Was his story worth telling? The fact that you have read this far suggests the answer. To fully understand Sonny Franzese, we must see him in the bigger picture of American organized crime history. The Mafia did not just appear fully formed. It grew over decades, shaped by people moving to the country, prohibition, police actions, and cultural changes. Sonny's parents were part of the big wave of Italian immigrants who came to America between 1880 and 1920. During this time, about 4 million Italians came to the United States, running from poverty and few opportunities in southern Italy and Sicily. They arrived with little money, little education, and no knowledge of English. They settled in neighborhoods of people from their own country in big cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia, where they recreated parts of the old country while adjusting to American life. These communities were close-knit, held together by a shared language, culture, and religion. They also operated partly outside the main American legal system, handling problems internally and relying on traditional power figures rather than the police or courts they did not trust and often could not use. Because of language problems, created a good place for organized crime too. Young men like Sonny, growing up in these communities, saw few paths to success. They could work honest but difficult jobs for little pay, like Sonny's father in his bakery, or they could join the neighborhood's criminal group, which offered faster money, higher status, and a sense of belonging to something powerful. Although Prohibition, from 1920 to 1933, ended when Sonny was still a teenager, its effect on organized crime was huge. The ban on alcohol created a very large black market, and Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal groups rushed to supply it. The profits were huge. The violence was intense, and the groups that grew during Prohibition laid the groundwork for decades of mob power. By the time Sonny joined the life in the late 1930s, the post-Prohibition mob was well established. The Castellammarese War of 1931 had reorganized New York's Italian criminal groups into the five-family structure: Bonanno, Colombo, originally Profaci, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. This structure provided stability, reduced internal fighting, and created clear power levels and territories. Sonny entered this established system, working his way up through a group that had clear rules, proven methods, and a lot of power. He was not a trailblazer or an inventor. He was a perfect example of someone practicing a well-known craft. The period of Sonny's prime was the same as what many think of as the Mafia's golden age in America. During these decades, organized crime had huge influence over labor unions, legal businesses, entertainment, and political corruption. During this time, being a made man in the Mafia meant something. It gave you real power and status. People feared and respected you. You had connections that could solve problems, open doors, and destroy enemies. This was the world Sonny lived in during his best years. The Mafia's decline began seriously in the 1980s with the use of RICO, racketeer-influenced, and corrupt organizations laws. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge entire groups rather than just individual criminals, making it possible to take down entire family leaderships in single court cases. The famous commission trial of 1985-1986 convicted the leaders of all five families at the same time. A huge victory for law enforcement. Similar major cases followed throughout the 1980s and 1990s, wiping out mob leadership. But even more damaging than RICO was the breakdown of Omerta. Starting in the 1980s, high-ranking gangsters began cooperating with law enforcement in ways that had never happened before. The witness protection program made cooperation possible by moving families and giving them new identities. The threat of life sentences made cooperation appealing. And once some bosses started talking, it became harder to argue that no one else should. Sammy the Bull Gravano's cooperation in the early 1990s was especially damaging. As underboss of the Gambino family, Gravano was one of the highest-ranking gangsters ever to flip. His testimony helped convict John Gotti and sent shockwaves through organized crime. If someone at Gravano's level could break Omerta, what did the code even mean anymore? By the time Sonny was serving his final prison sentence in the 2010s, the Mafia he had joined in 1950 was gone. It still existed, but as a shadow of its old self, smaller, weaker, less disciplined, and less respected. The new generation of gangsters looked at cooperation as a practical choice rather than an unthinkable betrayal. Sonny represented the old guard, the last link to a time when the code meant something, when made men chose death or life imprisonment over testifying. His complete refusal to break, which he kept up until his death at 103, stood in sharp contrast to the modern mob's practical approach to cooperation. Popular culture has created a mythology around the mafia that is often very different from reality. Movies like The Godfather trilogy presented an almost romantic vision of organized crime, a close-knit family with its own honor code, forced into violence by circumstances, and staying loyal even when facing destruction. The TV show The Sopranos presented a more psychologically complex vision, but still one that focused on family bonds, internal fights, and a certain nobility in keeping the code. The reality was generally uglier. Most gangsters were not smart planners, but violent enforcers and petty criminals. Family bonds were often put second to business interests. Code was broken as often as it was honored. Loyalty was kept through fear as much as respect. And yet, Sonny Franzese somehow represented both the mythology and the reality. Genuinely was charming and classy when the situation needed it. Genuinely did stay loyal and follow Omerta throughout his life. He genuinely did have relationships with celebrities and move in glamorous circles. In Sonny, the mythology and the reality came together in ways that were unusual even for the mob's golden age. This made him valuable as a symbol. When the Colombo family needed someone to represent the old ways, they turned to Sonny, even at 88 years old. When journalists wanted to write about the old-school mafia, they looked for Sonny. When filmmakers wanted to understand how the real mob operated during its peak, Sonny was a living link to that time. After 103 years, many of them in the public eye, Sonny Franzese built up not just a criminal record, but a legend. Some stories about him are well documented and proven. Others are unproven stories, repeated so often that they feel true without necessarily being true. Telling the difference between fact and legend is important for understanding who Sonny actually was versus who he became in American mythology. Verified facts include: born February 6, 1917, in Naples, Italy, during his parents' visit. Became a made man in 1950 at age 33. Served as underboss from 1963 to 1967 and again from 2005 to 2007. Convicted of bank robbery conspiracy in 1967. Sentenced to 50 years in 1970. Released on parole in 1978. Broke parole at least 6 times over the following decades. Caught on a wire in 2006 discussing criminal activities and ways to get rid of bodies. Convicted in 2011 at age 94. Released in 2017 at age 100. His son, John Franzese Jr., testified against him in 2010. Died February 24, 2020. At age 103, he was involved with Butter Records in the Yazidja 1960s. He was a regular at the Copacabana in the 1950s and 1960s. He knew various celebrities. These facts are documented in court records, newspaper articles, and multiple reliable sources. Likely true, but not as firmly documented. Estimated to have killed or ordered 40 to 50 murders. Specific disposal methods involving kiddie pools, microwaves, and garbage disposals are based on a recorded conversation. The story of Frank Sinatra kissing his ring is widely reported, but the specific details are unclear. His relationships with specific celebrities are generally confirmed, but the details of specific friendships vary in documentation. His involvement in financing, Deep Throat, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is claimed in multiple sources. But the exact nature of his involvement is sometimes debated. The claim of his first murder at age 14 is made, but specific details are not verified. The challenge with any long-lived person who operated in the shadows is that stories build up, and separating proven fact from legend becomes harder and harder. Sonny himself, in his final interviews, had reasons to shape his own legacy, possibly exaggerating some things while downplaying others. What we can say with confidence is that Sonny Franzese was a high-ranking member of the Colombo crime family for decades, involved in murder, extortion, loan sharking, and various other serious crimes. He was exceptionally long-lived and disciplined, committed to Omerta throughout his life, connected to the entertainment industry during the 1960s and 1970s, eventually betrayed by his own son, and released from prison at the unprecedented age of 100. These facts alone make his story remarkable. Without needing to add extra details. What made Sonny Franzese able to live the life he lived? What psychological traits allowed him to kill dozens of people, maintain family relationships, charm celebrities, survive decades in prison, and keep Omerta throughout? Perhaps Sonny's most essential psychological trait was his ability to compartmentalize, to separate different parts of his life into distinct categories that did not interfere with each other. When he was home with family, he could be genuinely loving and present. When he was conducting business, he could be ruthlessly violent. These were not contradictions to Sonny. They were different situations requiring different behaviors. This level of separation suggests either exceptional emotional control or possibly a degree of being disconnected from his feelings. Most people feel conflicted when their actions go against their self-image. If you think of yourself as a good person, committing violence creates psychological stress. Sonny apparently felt little such stress, which suggests he had either accepted these contradictions or never saw them as contradictions in the first place. Sonny showed extraordinary discipline throughout his life, keeping Omerta for over 70 years through countless interrogations, arrests, and years in prison requires an iron will most people break under far less pressure. The fact that Sonny never did suggests both a deep belief in the code and exceptional self-control. This discipline was also seen in his business practices, his physical health, and his relationships. He did not develop the drug or drinking problems that affected many gangsters. He kept himself physically well into old age. He managed complex criminal operations with what seemed to be skill. This was not the impulsive violence of a thug, but the calculated business practices of a criminal boss. Multiple stories describe Sonny as charming when he chose to be. Celebrities wanted his company. He commanded respect not just through fear, but through personal appeal. This suggests a lot of social intelligence, the ability to read situations, understand what people wanted, and act in ways that got positive responses. Charm combined with violence is a particularly dangerous combination. It allows someone to attract followers, build networks, and operate well in both legal and criminal worlds. Sonny's ability to move between the sea, Copacabana, and back alley beatings required this social flexibility. The military's description, psychoneurotic with pronounced homicidal tendencies, suggests that even in 1942, psychological experts saw something unusual about Sonny's psychological makeup. While we must be careful about diagnosing someone from the past, Sonny's life pattern suggests he had much less empathy than typical human emotional responses. Killing 40 to 50 people and disposing of their bodies like industrial waste requires an emotional detachment that most people do not have. This does not means Sonny was incapable of all. Empathy. His relationships with family suggests some ability for emotional connection, but it seems he could selectively turn empathy on or off depending on the situation. Sonny's commitment to the Mafia and to Omerta was not just practical. It seemed to be a core part of who he was. He was not pretending to be a gangster. He was a gangster completely and without any doubt. This deep identification with his chosen life made certain behaviors automatic, rather than requiring effort. When faced with the choice between cooperation and prison, Sonny chose prison without seeming to hesitate. This was not because he calculated that cooperation would be more dangerous, though it might have been. It was because cooperating would mean he was no longer Sonny Franzese, a made man and an underboss. His identity was more important than freedom. Living to 103 in Sonny's profession required not just luck, but exceptional survival instincts. He knew when to escalate and when to back down. He kept the respect of younger gangsters who could have seen him as old-fashioned. He navigated changing power structures within the family and the larger five-family world. This survival instinct also showed up physically. Despite decades in prison, a stressful lifestyle, and an age that should have killed him multiple times, Sonny kept living. While some of this was certainly genetic luck, some might have been his sheer determination not to die, not to give his enemies or the government that satisfaction. Religious traditions often speak of deathbed conversions, of even the most hardened sinners finding a change of heart in their final moments. Did anything like this happen with Sonny Franzese? The evidence suggests no, not in any normal sense. Sonny did not speak against his past, did not admit to specific crimes, and did not ask for forgiveness from his victims or their families. He made up with his son, John Jr., which represented a form of personal healing. But this was not the same as a moral review of his life's work. And yet, there might be something good in the fact that Sonny agreed to tell his story in his final years. By participating in interviews and authorizing a biography, he created a historical record. He provided information about a time that would otherwise be lost. He offered insights into how the Mafia actually operated during its peak years. Was not redemption in a moral sense. He was not making up for his sins or making things right, but it was a contribution to historical understanding, and that has some value, no matter his reasons for doing it. The reconciliation with John Jr. also suggests some ability for forgiveness and love that went beyond the mob code. Sonny had vowed to have John Jr. killed for testifying against him, that he instead made up with his son in his final years shows that family ultimately mattered more than revenge, that the father could overcome the mobster's need for payback. This does not excuse Sonny's crimes or turn him into a sympathetic character, but it does add complexity to our understanding of him. He was not a simple monster or a one-sided villain. He was a complex person capable of both terrible violence and genuine love, of absolute loyalty to his code and flexibility when it came to family relationships. Perhaps the closest Sonny came to redemption was simply in surviving long enough to see the world change around him, to witness the decline of the group he had served for 70 years, and to understand that the code he had lived by was vanishing. Whether he viewed this with sadness, acceptance, or indifference, we cannot know, but he was a witness to the end of an era, and he carried the stories of that era with him until the very end. On a hospital bed in New York City on February 24th, 2020, John Sonny Franzese took his last breath. The man who had refused to die for so long, who had survived when survival seemed impossible, who had outlived enemies, friends, associates, and even his own son's testimony. This man finally accepted what all humans must accept: death. His death was ordinary in the most extraordinary way. No shootout, no gang violence, no prison stabbing got natural causes. Surrounded by family, peaceful, for a man whose life was defined by violence, whose job almost guaranteed a violent end. This peaceful death might have been the most unexpected twist in his extraordinary story. Sonny Franzese lived 103 years, 6 months, and 18 days. He was born when World War I was still happening, when the Russian Revolution was changing Russia into the Soviet Union, and when the Mafia as we know it was just beginning to form in America. He died during a global pandemic, in an age of smartphones and social media, when the Mafia he had served was a fading ghost of its former power. He witnessed more change, more history, and more transformation of American society than almost anyone. And through all of it, he remained fundamentally himself, a made man, an underboss, a killer, a father, a husband, a friend, an enemy, a symbol, a legend. His legacy is complicated and impossible to summarize simply. He was a serial killer responsible for dozens of deaths, a loving father to 8 children, a disciplined professional who worked at the highest levels of organized crime, a celebrity socialite who ate with Frank Sinatra, a convict who spent over 30 years in prison, a symbol of Omerta who never broke his promise, man betrayed by his own son who found forgiveness. In the end, the last living link to the Mafia's golden age. None of these descriptions fully captures him because he was all of them at the same time. The contradictions were not flaws in his character. They were its features. Sonny Franzese was a man who contained many things, and most of them were dark. Was he evil by any normal moral standard? Yes. He killed for money and power. He ruined lives through extortion and loan sharking. He corrupted legal businesses and institutions. He chose violence as a first choice, rather than a last one. The suffering he caused far outweighs any positive things he did for the world. Was he fascinating? Absolutely. His long life alone makes him worthy of historical attention. His discipline and commitment to his code, no matter how wrong that code might be, made him stand out even among criminals. His ability to move between worlds, between violence and glamour, between crime and family life, showed a psychological complexity that is hard to simply categorize. The question we are left with is whether studying Sonny Franzese's life serves any useful purpose beyond a dark curiosity. I believe it does, for several reasons. Number 1, historical understanding. Sonny was a living link to a time that has mostly disappeared. Through him, we can better understand how the American Mafia actually worked during its peak years. Not the romanticized version from movies, but the complex reality of criminal groups that had huge power while keeping a detailed code of behavior. Number 2, psychological insight. Sonny's life shows how humans can separate morality, how loyalty and violence can exist together, and how identity can become so tied up with a chosen path that changing becomes impossible, even when it would help you. These are not just questions for school. They help us understand how people become and stay committed to extreme groups of all kinds. Number 3, cultural reflection. The fact that we find Sonny's story interesting says something about American culture's complicated relationship with outlaws, codes of honor, and the mythology of organized crime. Looking at why we are drawn to such stories, even while knowing their subjects are criminals, helps us understand our own values and contradictions. Number 4, a cautionary tale. Sonny's life shows the costs of choosing a criminal path, not just legal costs, but human ones. His family was broken. His son betrayed him. He spent decades in prison. He lived to see the group he served decline into something unimportant. The long life that seemed like a victory also meant being a witness to the complete failure of the world he had built. Sonny's death did not end Franzese's story. It simply closed one chapter while others continued. Michael Franzese has continued to build his post-mob career. He remains active as a motivational speaker, YouTuber, and media personality. His channel, where he discusses his past life and comments on mob-related news and movies, has gotten millions of views. He has written multiple books, participated in countless interviews, and established himself as one of the most accessible former high-ranking gangsters willing to discuss the life. Michael's relationship with his past is complicated. He profits from his mob history while speaking against that lifestyle. He says he never killed anyone, separating himself from the violence his father embraced. He has built a legal career based on being a former illegal operator. Whether this represents real redemption or just a successful switch to a different way of making money is debatable, but it is certainly a different path than his father took. Michael has spoken publicly about his complex feelings towards Sonny: love and fear, admiration and disappointment, pride in his father's discipline, and horror at his father's violence. These mixed emotions were never fully resolved, and perhaps they could not be. How do you make sense of loving someone who once approved your murder? John Franzese Jr., living as Matt Pazzarelli, has kept a much lower profile. His life after testifying has been difficult, by most accounts. The reconciliation with his father provided some closure, but it did not erase the years of being apart or the fact that he broke the code his father lived and died by. He struggles with health issues related to his HIV status, with addiction, recovery, and with the pain of growing up as Sonny Franzese's son. John Jr.'s story is perhaps the saddest in the family story. He never found success in either legal or criminal work. He lived in his father's and brother's shadows. His cooperation with law enforcement came from desperation rather than a moral change of heart. He betrayed his father but gained little in return except survival and being cut off from his family. The reconciliation at the end was a gift, but it could not undo decades of pain. The other Franzese children have largely stayed out of the public eye. They probably carried their own complicated relationships with their father's legacy. Pride in his long life and discipline, perhaps mixed with awareness of the violence and crime that defined his life. They lost their father repeatedly to prison, to the life, and finally to death at 103. Growing up as Sonny Franzese's children meant living with the constant knowledge that their father might be arrested, might be killed, or might disappear at any moment. Christina Tina Franzese outlived her husband. Her life as a mob wife lasted for decades, raising children while Sonny was in prison and keeping up appearances while knowing the truth about his activities. She eventually reached a breaking point and separated from him. Her decision to side with John Jr. during the trial showed that she had finally chosen her own well-being and that of her son over loyalty to Sonny and the life. Whether she found peace after Sonny's death, we do not know. The Colombo crime family continues to exist, though in a much smaller form. Sonny's death removed one of the last living links to the family's glory days. The current leadership operates in a completely different world, heavily watched, weakened by decades of court cases, and largely unimportant compared to the group's 1960s peak. Sonny lived long enough to see the group he served become a shadow of what it once was. So who was John Sonny Franzese? Was he a monster? Absolutely. He killed dozens of people. He destroyed lives. He broke laws. He chose violence and crime over everything else. But he was also a product of his time and place. An Italian immigrant kid in Brooklyn during the Depression and Prohibition, when organized crime was a path to the American dream for many young men like him. He was loyal to his code, even when it cost him everything, even when his own son turned against him. Even when he spent 30 years behind bars, and even when he was 93 years old on trial again, he never broke. Is that admirable? That is for you to decide as you fall asleep tonight. He hung out with celebrities. He had women, money, and power. He commanded respect through fear. He lived 103 years, longer than almost anyone, criminal or otherwise. He died free, in bed, of natural causes. How many gangsters can say that? But he also spent 3 decades in cages. He lost his son. He grew old and sick behind bars. He watched his world die around him. The mafia he loved became a shell of its former self. The code he lived by became a thing of the past. Was it worth it? Sonny never said. Right until the end. He kept his secrets. He played his part. He was the last of a dying breed. And now, like all things, he is gone. Just a story we tell in the dark. Just a legend whispered about. Just a name that gets fewer and fewer Google searches each year as the world moves on. But tonight, we remembered him. We told his story. We walked through his 103 years on this earth. From Naples to Brooklyn, from Greenpoint to the Copacabana, from Colombo underboss to federal inmate number . From feared gangster to frail old man. This was Sonny Franzese, the last old-school gangster, the man who never broke, the legend who lived too long and saw too much . And now you know his story, too. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible journey. If you made it this far, you are a real one. Sonny's story is one for the ages. Literally 103 years of life, with most of it spent on the wrong side of the law, but fascinating every step of the way. If you enjoyed this deep look into one of history's most famous gangsters, please hit that like button. It helps us reach more people who love these true crime stories. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel, because we have so many more stories like this coming your way. Real gangsters, real crimes, real history told the way it should be told. Drop a comment and let me know what part of Sonny's story shocked you most. Do you think the old mafia code of silence was honorable or foolish? Should his son have testified against him? Which gangster should we cover next? And if you are falling asleep right now, sweet dreams. Let Sonny's story fade into the background as you rest. We will be here with another tale from the criminal world soon. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And remember, these stories are lessons in what not to do. Crime does not pay, even if you live to be 103. Until next time, stay safe out there.